Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm your host, Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, together with Bettina Krause, my co-host, editor of Liberty Magazine. And together we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. And Bettina, if ever there were an extreme, I think this topic that we're going to discuss here, it's one thing. Politicians forever have been invoking, things like God bless America, and the implication has always been that, well, I'm on God's side, right? And vote for me because I'm on God's side. And that's always been a subtext of American politics, Abraham Lincoln being a prominent exception who was quite outspoken in denying that God was on the side of the North and insisting that both the North and the South were sharing the punishment for the sin of slavery, right? And for the oppression of imported Africans. But the Trump campaign has gone to, has exceeded all prior expressions of claiming God's blessing. What is it that they have done now?
So, Alan, what I have been seeing and what many people have been emailing me about is a political ad, which I'm not sure if it is a Trump campaign. I believe it's supporters of Trump that have put together that sort of co-opt sort of these messianic ideas about Trump, and the tagline is, so God made Trump. The idea that Trump has been raised for such a time as this, to meet the emergency of the moment. And more than that, he has divine approval. He is chosen by God. And in fact, Alan, just before we went on air, Luke, our producer, mentioned a song, The Chosen One, which is also about former President Trump. And it's sort of written in the style of a worship song and extolling the virtues of Trump as a strong leader who will preserve Christian values.
And, just to be clear, I have plenty of friends and colleagues who are politically conservative, who are clear-eyed about, how they view Trump. They don't, attribute to him any particularly extraordinary character or powers, but they still prefer conservative politics, and they're likely to vote for him. That's fine. We're not partisan here.
No.
The concern, I think, that you're sharing is kind of contrary to the contrary to the American spirit. The American spirit is eternally suspicious of our politicians. We don't trust our politicians, and yet, here we have a phenomenon of a charismatic politician that people are willing to suspend disbelief and invest their hopes in ways that shed skepticism, which I think that's one of the most troubling aspects of this whole phenomenon.
And as you pointed out, Alan, religion has always been a tool of politicians. And I think what we're seeing, not just in America, but globally, is where Christianity is perceived is sort of in this defensive crouch. They're looking for, they feel that their values are under attack by a secular culture around them. And so they're particularly vulnerable to authoritarian style leaders who say, hey, I can look after you. I can stand up for your values. Look at Viktor Orban in Hungary. Look at even Putin in Russia. He sort of styles himself as a defender of Orthodox Christian values. But also other religions. Look at Prime Minister Modi in India. He is standing for Hinduism as a key feature of what it means to be an Indian citizen. And he's combining religion and politics in a way that's very appealing to those who feel that their own religious values are under attack.
I would just close with this thought, Bettina. Chuck Colson, who famously served President Nixon and was enmeshed in the Watergate scandal, he had a born-again experience, became a very prominent Christian leader. His very first book after the book Born Again was called Kingdoms in Conflict. And I think that's a concept we need to keep in mind, that the kingdoms of God and country are in conflict. And Colson was on the inside of manipulating the church for the benefit of the politicians. And that's a phenomenon that the church has always been way too naive about, how readily manipulated we are in support of somebody's political ambitions.
Absolutely. Yes, and on that note, let's move on to our interview. And I'm particularly excited to listen to what our guest has to say, BrianKaylor. So let's meet him. We are absolutely delighted to have with us today BrianKaylor, who is an award-winning author and he's a journalist. He's also president and editor-in-chief of Word and Way, which you may have heard of. It's a Christian media company that's based in Missouri. And he is also associate director of ChurchNet, which is a Baptist network also in Missouri. But today we're talking about Brian's recently published book, which is called Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. And I have to say, Brian, well, first of all, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with both of you.
And the title of your book is absolutely intriguing, because I think for those of us who are outside of evangelical Christianity or conservative, very conservative Christianity, we tend to presume that Christian nationalism is something that's like over there. It doesn't concern us. But you're challenging that idea, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this was a little bit of a revelation for Bo Underwood, my co-author, and I, as we've been writing about Christian nationalism at Word and Way for several years, even pre-January 6th insurrection, which I know post that is when a lot of attention has gone to the topic of Christian nationalism. And one of the things we started to realize was that anytime those espousing Christian nationalism were pointing to evidence, if you will, to say we're supposed to be a Christian nation, I'm talking, individuals like Tony Perkins or, Greg Locke, Franklin Graham, individuals that are pushing this idea that we should be a Christian nation. The stuff that they would point to was actually stuff that mainline Protestants helped put in place. And so seeing enough trend, we started researching this deeper and realized, one, there's an untold story here. And it's important to know that, because if we really want to address Christian nationalism, we have to know how we got here. It's not a Trumpian problem. It's not even a white evangelical problem. It's much richer and much deeper.
Well, to put this in, when I think of this topic, Brian, and to put it in historical context, from roughly the Scopes Monkey trial until sometime after the Supreme Court religion cases of the 60s and Roe v. Wade in the 70s and the Bob Jones University case, fundamentalism was basically in cultural retreat, isolation even, and it was mainstream Protestantism that had the cultural hegemony, right? They were the dominant force, and things like putting in one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance in the 50s, this came out of the mainstream, not out of the fundamentalist right?
You're exactly right. So all of the stuff that's happening, we're in a wave of Christian nationalism right now that kind of comes in waves in our history. The last really big wave was the late 40s and then throughout the 50s, when we see stuff like Under God and the Pledge, In God We Trust as the national model, National Prayer Breakfast created. All this stuff is happening at a time when mainline Protestants are the cultural and political elites. So our presidents, our members of Congress are sitting in these churches. The religious dominant figures in society are from these pulpits. They're not from evangelical and fundamentalist congregations. And so all of this stuff is coming from mainline Protestant power.
So why is this so hard to recognize for those of us who may not think of ourselves as Christian nationalists? I mean, and you use the term civil religion. Help us understand how many of us buy into or accept this idea of civil religion, where we may sort of distance ourselves from overt Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important concept that we, as you know, we had to unpack in the book. I think for a long time, we convinced ourselves that a lot of these things were civil religion, kind of innocent, unifying language to bring us all together. In fact, Robert Bellah, who developed this concept of civil religion, actually refers to, under God being added to the Pledge of Allegiance as an example of civil religion. And so the argument we're making is actually it was never quite so innocent, that it really was Christian nationalism. And the Presbyterian pastor, mainline Protestant leader, who was very progressive, he later marches with Martin Luther King Jr., has King preach at his church against the Vietnam War. We're talking about a progressive Christian who also wanted us to be a Christian nation. So he preaches this sermon in 1954 because he knows Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be sitting in the congregation. And the whole point of the sermon is to convince Dwight D. Eisenhower to put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And it worked. Which, I mean, I have to admit, I've never had a sermon have that kind of impact. I'm happy when people remember it a week later. But I mean, in just 4 months, the pledge is rewritten. And 70 years ago, this month, Flag Day, June 14th, Eisenhower signs the bill. But in that sermon, he specifically says that an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms, and that atheistic Americans are spiritual parasites. So from the beginning, this was not civil religion. This was not unifying. It was Christian nationalism civically excommunicating some people because of their beliefs. But back then, 92% of Americans were Christian, so I don't think we felt it. Today, in our pluralistic society, we realize how divisive this is. We realize how exclusionary it is. Although now it's mostly coming from conservative evangelicals, but they're just using the same political and religious playbook that mainline Protestants were doing in the 1950s.
So let's unpack for a minute this notion of civil religion, because you say, okay, well, it's Christian in form, right? It looks Christian. It invokes Christian language. I dissent from the notion that there's anything Christian really about American civil religion. What explain a little deeper how your understanding of what it is.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think civil religion actually has 2 significant problems. One is it invokes enough God language that it is actually exclusionary, and it doesn't work in a pluralistic democracy. And then the flip side is exactly what you're saying, right? It also is too generic for those of us that truly make God claims. And this is one of the problems we see in, some of the Supreme Court writings about under God in the Pledge, for instance, right? That is, it's generic. That is just civil religion. Well, if that's the case, then who is this, quote, God that the state is asking us to pledge allegiance to, right? You're either making children in public schools make a sectarian declaration, or you're asking them to take the Lord's name in vain by making a declaration that actually isn't Christian. And so it's a little bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of approach here. But I think civil religion has both that civic and that religious problem.
Brian, you refer in your book to a phenomenon which many Americans find commonplace. But for me, as an Australian coming to America, 20 plus years ago, I found very jarring. And that is having American flags in church sanctuaries. When I first worshipped in churches with flags right up there, right beside the pastor preaching, it was a difficult thing for me to get my head around. I couldn't understand why it was there, what it signified. I have to say, I've been here for 2 decades or more. I've grown used to it. And I suspect many Christians are simply used to it. Why are flags in sanctuaries a problem?
As soon as you started that question, I knew where we were going, because it really is a phenomenon that is strange to Christians from other countries when they come to visit us. And not new strange. As we know in the book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was confused seeing this when he visited the United States as well. And as we know, the flags generally come into the sanctuary or on church property during times of war. There's a few during the Civil War, but particularly World War I among like German-speaking congregations and communities. And then World War II, we particularly see this. And then the second part that you noted, I think, is so important. Eventually, it just seems normal. And so for most Christians today, the flag has always been there. It just seems like the way things are supposed to be. But for the history of Christianity in America, let alone the history of Christianity, it's actually still a really new phenomenon. In fact, in a lot of churches, I mean, if your church is 150 years or more older, that means that for most of the lifespan of your church, the flag probably was not there. And so it's still even new in the congregations. And this is one of the things I think is really, really dangerous about Christian nationalism, is that it so merges Christian and American identities that we start to see them as synonymous, as one. And we almost forget, well, what's Christian, what's gospel, and what's American? What's the wheat and what's the chaff here?
Well, I have to say I was not eager to jump into this particular topic because I was warned years ago by a prominent Australian Adventist evangelist to stay away from this. But since you raised it, there's another problem here, which is that American flag etiquette requires the American flag to be in the preeminent position. And that means that the American flag and the Christian flag tend to be displayed at the same level, height. When if you're going to have, maybe you just take the Christian flag out if you're not going to take the American flag out. But, now you're displaying the Christian flag symbolically, not in a superior sense of status or authority, which is symbolically really not okay.
You're absolutely right. And we note this in the book of this problem of the U.S. flag code. Then it's this idea. Jesus warned us, you cannot serve two masters. Right? One of them will ultimately be when they come into conflict, one of them will be who you serve. And that we're showing symbolically with the way we display the two flags, we've already chosen a side. We've already said who is our key master that we're pledging allegiance to, and even that word, right? That's the loyalty we owe to our Lord, liege in French, allegiance, right? There's something really troubling there. And I always think about what Winston Churchill warned about how we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And what have we been teaching for generations, discipling generations of Christians to view American and Christianity as synonymous? And if there's any conflict, we're American first. We're American flag first.
So before we leave this, I got to go here, Bettina. We have opposed measures that criminalize what's called the desecration of the American flag, and insisted that the term desecration be removed. We have no problem with respecting the flag and, having rules for treating it with respect and not, trashing it. We respect the flag, but it is not sacred. And to desecrate means you're regarding it as sacred, which is at the heart of this problem, isn't it?
Yes, exactly right. I think that's good in thinking about what's sacred and what's secular. And we have merged the two so much. And Christian nationalism wants us to combine those and confuse those identities.
So, coming again from the perspective of someone who has been an outsider to America, and digging deeper beneath this idea of civil religion, the idea of the mythology of our nation, of the idea of our origin story. In America, it's very different to many other nations. In Australia, our mythology is the British sent convicts to the Australian continent, right?
Is that mythology or is that history?
That is history, I can tell you. That's a whole other podcast. But here in America, we have a very particular origin story that I think makes it harder to understand when religion is being abused and when religion is being infused into political life in inappropriate ways. Would you agree with that?
That's right. We have this, this debate about church and state and religious liberty is, I mean, it's there from the beginning. So we have a lot of people are fleeing Europe, fleeing what we would call Christian nationalism, right? The uniting of church and state, religious persecution by the state. But then some of them aren't really looking for religious liberty. They just want to be the ones in charge, right? So Massachusetts Bay Colony, for instance, is now persecuting people for religious beliefs. And then we have the dissenting opinion, Roger Williams in Rhode Island and some others, that Quakers that are pushing for true religious liberty for all. So this debate about, Christian, whether we should be a Christian nation or not is not a new one. I mean, most of our colonies were, Christian colonies, if you will, Christian states. And so we have this debate going on. And so in many ways, we're still having the same debate of what kind of nation do we want to be?
Right. So, the way that I have framed this and looking at our history, Brian, interested in your thoughts about this, is that Christian nationalism is really neo-Puritanism. That, you had kind of two parties back in the day. You had kind of the Puritan, Calvinist, we know the truth, and we want to govern a godly, commonwealth. And if you're not of us, then, really you don't belong. And that was the Puritan. But our founding fathers' generation rejected that and clearly had a much more inclusive and even, secular as, well, I don't know if I'll say famous or renowned, but the book, The Godless Constitution, really explored very well.
Yeah, that's right. And, I come from the Baptist tradition, as you know, and I mean, some Baptists today, I lament, have kind of lost that original ideal, but we were initially on that other side of the Puritan. We were the ones being persecuted and, being put in prison in Virginia by Anglicans. And it really is a remarkable thing that the United States was founded with this idea of church-state separation and religious liberty for all people. It's remarkable from, the writings of individuals like Thomas Jefferson, but even I think more so from someone like James Madison, who's actually a member of the dominant church. He has the power and privilege that would come to him through Christian nationalism, and he takes up the cause of some Baptists that are in prison simply for preaching. And that is a remarkable moment that changed our history, that someone from power and privilege decided to advocate for religious liberty for all people. And it has allowed religion to flourish. It's been good for the state, which I think is important, but even more so, it's been important, it's been good for the churches.
It's funny, when we appeal to the historical record, I mean, if you go mining for one point of view, you can find it. If you go mining for another point of view, you could probably find it as well. And I agree, there is such a strong element of religious liberty for all, sort of the idea of a pluralistic society, the idea of separation of church and state. That is part of our historical record, but also part of our historical record, for instance, are state hired and paid chaplains to pray in legislatures. And so that also is part of our historical record, which is what others appeal to when they're discussing this idea of, are we a Christian nation? How do we reconcile that?
I mean, so it's one of those things you can often see, like, what side someone is on that debate today based on which founder they quote. So, I mean, you do have some like a Patrick Henry or John Adams that really do want church and state to be together. And then the chaplain one is an important issue. I mean, we unpack this in the book. We think it's part of Christian nationalism, and it's something that mainline Protestants have been most of the chaplains in Congress throughout U.S. history. This has been their purview and their position of power and privilege. But it's the one key church-state issue that James Madison lost. Right? I just mentioned him. He wins a lot of things. He argues against congressional chaplains. He thinks it's an establishment of church and state, that we shouldn't have it. He happened to lose that particular debate. And so I think it's a great reminder that we've never been perfect. Right? This idea that we're always supposed to be striving for a more perfect union is a good reminder. We've made progress on a lot of other failures of our nation, slavery and right women to vote. There's other realms that I think we can continue to lean into, the better angels, the better vision of what we could be.
Well, and speaking of how we have never been perfect, as we're recording this show today, my history app says that today is the anniversary of the very first Salem witch trial.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you mentioned to me, Brian, the Baptist thinking on church and state from colonial times had profound influence on the church-state arrangements that emerged. And as I've often said when I interview Baptists, and I think I've said this to you before, we Seventh-day Adventists really stand on Baptist shoulders in our understanding of, what these ideals really are, ideals of voluntarism in religion, that religion is not the business of government, that, a free conscience. Soul liberty, I think, is the Baptist term, right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And it's great that there are a number of traditions today that do, advocate for a free church and a free society. And I'm glad to see groups like Seventh-day Adventists at the time when a lot of Baptists today no longer hold to some of these ideas. So it's good to see that some of that tradition is still being upheld today.
Well, I call this the lonely middle, frankly, because, there's powerful forces on the left and the right that are equally exclusionary and not inclusive. And to be, advocating for an inclusive approach to religious freedom and all puts us kind of what I say is the lonely middle.
Yeah.
So, we need to wrap up. But before we do, Brian, what are some concrete steps that people listening can take to, your book is called Baptizing America. How do we unbaptize America?
Yeah, I like that. And we end the book by helping people think about, so what's next? It's important to know our history, know how we got here. But one of the key things that we hope is that people won't just blame the other, right? It can be cathartic to point at white conservative evangelicals, and I actually grew up in that tradition, though I'm now a mainline Protestant, and say, oh, they're the problem. To look at the people storming the Capitol on January 6th and say, oh, they're the problem. But Christian nationalism it's on a continuum, and there's a little bit of it in all of us, especially any of us that grew up in a white Christian church. In the U.S., Christian nationalism was just in the air we breathe. And so we all need to do this work of detoxing. And so we encourage people to look at their own church, their own denomination, their own tradition, and what are ways that we can do this difficult but really important work of separating out what's American and what's Christian in our own spheres of influence. Because, the Robert Jeffersons and the Sean Foyts, they're not going to listen to me. And they're not going to probably listen to you or any of those listening. But we can all have some impact on our own congregation to get away from Christian nationalism and more about what it means to actually follow the radical and global vision of Jesus.
Wow, that's a great way to wrap up. And that's a challenge to me in how we conduct our own work. I appreciate that very much, Brian.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, Alan, that was another great interview. And one thing that really stood out for me was when Brian said that within his tradition, the Baptist tradition, there's been a drift from the values of separation of church and state, where once there were staunch defenders of that idea, that has become less common. But we are seeing that, I think, in even the tradition that you and I come from, the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, right?
Yes, we certainly have. I think that the reality is that the media has our attention far more than our pastors, our own denominations, our own religious traditions. And there's just this, pervasive Christian nationalism within our media today. And it's part of the kind of culture war context that we find ourselves in. If you're either, a liberal, in the bubble of secular media, or you're a conservative in the bubble of a media that's very sort of pervaded with Christian nationalism. And so you just kind of take that for granted.
When I go back into the archives of Liberty Magazine and I read in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the editors of Liberty Magazine were very pointed in their social commentary, their cultural commentary, their political commentary. They were quite edgy in how they addressed issues. And I find that in our cultural moment, I have to be incredibly diplomatic. I have to be careful in the way that I address issues in a way that my predecessors didn't have to be. So which bears out exactly what you were saying, Alan.
Well, and as careful as you are, once in a while we can get letters from churches that are very conservative that reject our magazine and our traditional Adventist concepts of religious freedom.
Right. And I get those letters as well. And I guess the question that I continually wrestle with is, how do we burst those conservative and liberal bubbles? How do we speak to people in today's environment where they are, inhabiting extremes of media consumption?
Well, we've done some shows on that very topic, and I'm sure we're going to do some more. But I think that, we have to remind people to listen to the other side, whatever the other side is, and to broaden your, exposure to points of view and to resources, because, you're going to find that there's stuff to agree with on the other side. You may disagree with 90% of it, but you're going to find, they're not all crazy. There's still well-meaning people who, put their pants on one leg at a time, just like you do.
And that is an excellent way to wrap up our program today, because that's one of our perennial themes, find in the middle ground, because this has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, together with Alan Reinach. And until next time, remember that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.